I'm done talking about this.
You are so entitled.
What you just witnessed wasn't a simple disagreement inside a household. It was the echo of a limit being reached. For years, Dr. Simone lived the role most parents are praised for surviving. She built a life of provision, private schooling, high-priced vehicles, financial cushions, and a home run on sacrifice and relentless self-discipline. She didn't merely help her family, she sustained it. But tonight, the ground shifted. This was no longer about a Jeep. It wasn't even about dollars and cents. It was about a son who silently charged nearly $60,000 to his mother's card and still felt entitled to more, another luxury car.an unrestricted lifestyle.no consequences.no reckoning. When Dr. Simone finally tried to establish limits, to speak about maturity, responsibility, and the reality of her own future, she wasn't challenged. She was brushed aside. Her sacrifices were downplayed. Decades of effort reframed as an inconvenience. And nearby stood Cecil, physically there, emotionally restrained, loyal, yet ineffective, watching the family dynamic tilt in real time. This moment didn't just reveal entitlement. It revealed burnout. It revealed loneliness, and it showed how easily devotion curdles into resentment when boundaries never exist. Because when a mother finally says, "I can't do this anymore," the real question isn't whether healing is possible. It's whether that was the instant everything quietly began to collapse.
Michael spent over $60,000 by himself on this card. If I were you and I wanted a car, I wouldn't be arguing with the person.
For years, Dr. Simone existed inside a story the public thought it understood. Accomplished doctor, solid marriage, children raised with access, comfort, and open doors. From the outside, it looked like flawless control, a woman juggling ambition, motherhood, and responsibility without ever letting the weight slip. But behind closed doors, that balance was quietly cracking. Because giving everything always comes with a price. And eventually, someone has to pay it. This was never a story about money. It wasn't even about bad parenting. It was about what happens when limits are postponed for too long, when gratitude slowly mutates into entitlement, when help becomes expectation, and when a parent realizes, far too late, that love has been confused for obligation. For years, Dr. Simone did what countless parents believe is protection. She made sure her children never felt the instability she once knew. Elite schools, financial backing, cars, credit cards. A safety net stretched so wide that failure felt impossible. But an endless safety net doesn't just prevent falls. It can quietly trap everyone inside it. What made this moment different wasn't the argument. Families clash every day. What made it different was the sudden clarity that this wasn't guidance anymore. It was resistance. Resistance to growing up. Resistance to limits. Resistance to acknowledging sacrifice. At the center stood Michael, the youngest, whose expectations had quietly expanded beyond anything the family had ever named out loud. As it so often does, it started with money. Not lack, but excess. A credit card, never meant to be bottomless. A symbol of trust, not permission. And according to what came to light at that table, that trust had been pushed to nearly $60,000. But the spending wasn't what shattered the moment. The reaction was. Because when Dr. Simone tried to speak about responsibility, about adulthood, accountability, and the reality that nothing lasts forever, she wasn't met with reflection. She was brushed off. Her past struggles were dismissed as outdated. Her exhaustion treated as negotiable. Her future, even retirement, framed as a burden. That's when everything changed. Not from conversation to argument, but from family to confrontation.
I got scholarship money and loans.
Your mom was not able to do the things for you that you are able to do for us. I'm done talking about this.
Oh, I don't care.
Make sure whatever you bring out on that iPad is not going to cause me to pick up your pasta off your plate. And
the words didn't hit because they were loud. They hit because they were delivered calmly, without pause, without second thought, without any recognition of who sat on the other side of the table. In that instant, something essential fractured. This wasn't adolescent defiance. It wasn't momentary frustration. It was a worldview fully formed. A belief that parental sacrifice has no expiration date. That financial support is a guarantee, not a gift. That adulthood arrives without obligation. And most alarming of all, that struggle is optional when someone else is willing to carry it for you. For Dr. Simone, the consequences became impossible to deny. If she stayed on this road, she wouldn't just be sustaining her children's lifestyles, she would be locking them into permanent dependence. And in doing so, she would be erasing her own future piece by piece. Because the truth finally surfaced, unspoken but unmistakable, if she stopped giving, there was nothing underneath to catch them. And quietly standing inside that realization was Cecil. For years, Cecil had positioned himself as the steady force, the calm voice, the bridge between tension and resolution. He believed patience could eventually repair anything. But patience has a breaking point, especially when it turns into silence. And silence, in moments like this, is never neutral. As the pressure thickened, Cecil found himself trapped in a role no parent ever wants, watching the foundation of his family shift while understanding that every attempt to step in only pushed him further away. Not from outsiders, from his own home.
I get tired of being the lone man out. It's always three.
I'm jumping in.
You jump in. You can't speak for me because you don't think.
Those statements exposed more than irritation. They exposed surrender. Cecil wasn't simply losing a debate. He was confronting a system that had been established long before this meal ever began. A system where discipline was postponed, expectations quietly ballooned, and difficult conversations were sidestepped to preserve calm. But calm built on avoidance never lasts. And in that moment, it became impossible to ignore that Cecil's quiet, deliberate or not, carried weight. Not because he was indifferent, but because the lack of a united stance left Dr. Simone isolated at the precise moment she needed backup. She wasn't only pushing back against entitlement. She was battling fatigue. She was carrying years of suppressed frustration. And she was confronting the painful truth that love, by itself, had not equipped her children for real life. Beyond the walls of that house, reaction came fast. Social media erupted praise, criticism, arguments flying in every direction. Some celebrated Dr. Simone for finally setting boundaries. Others insisted that children should enjoy their parents' success without guilt. Comparisons flooded feeds, especially pointing to affluent white families whose children are often financially supported well into adulthood. But those comparisons missed a critical distinction. Generational wealth operates with systems, rules, trusts, limits. What played out here wasn't wealth strategy, it was emotional collapse. And at the heart of that collapse was a woman cornered into a choice: continue carrying everyone else, or finally carry herself. When the dinner ended, nothing was fixed. No apologies, no resolutions, no understanding, only distance, the kind that money and time can't repair. Because some moments permanently alter relationships. And this was one of them. For Dr. Simone, the truth was painful but undeniable. Moving forward meant accepting a life where her needs would always be secondary, where retirement would remain a moving target, where boundaries would continue to be ignored because they had never truly existed. And so, quietly, away from cameras and commentary, a resolve took shape, not fueled by rage, not driven by punishment, but by self-preservation. A resolve that would redefine the family dynamic. A resolve that would turn private strain into public fallout. A resolve that would finally answer the question no one dared to voice. What happens when a mother stops giving and begins choosing herself? Because once the words "I'm done" are spoken, there is no returning to what once was. The night didn't conclude with shouting or slammed doors. It ended with something far more unsettling. Silence. The kind of silence that settles in when everyone understands the conflict was never about money or vehicles or credit cards, but about control, responsibility, and a level of emotional fatigue that had been accumulating for years. When the cameras stopped, nothing reset. If anything, the distance thickened. Conversations shortened. Avoidance replaced honesty. What once felt like a united home now felt divided by invisible boundaries no one dared to cross. For Dr. Simone, the aftermath wasn't explosive, it was revealing. Because once entitlement is spoken aloud, it can't be erased. She replayed the words in her mind. Not with rage, but with disbelief. The ease with which her sacrifices were dismissed. The assumption that her effort was endless. The quiet expectation that her role was to give, indefinitely, unquestioned, and without acknowledgement. And beneath it all sat a truth she could no longer avoid. This wasn't just about Michael. It was about a system that had slowly taken shape inside her home, one where responsibility moved in a single direction, while expectation flowed freely the other way. Where accountability was optional, but support was mandatory. And systems like that don't fall apart on their own. Someone has to stop holding them together. Cecil felt the shift too. He had always believed time would smooth things over. That maturity would arrive naturally. That avoiding escalation was sometimes the wiser path. But as the aftermath unfolded, even he began to understand that silence doesn't always keep the peace. Sometimes it protects dysfunction. Because the uncomfortable truth became clear, by refusing to choose sides, he had effectively left Dr. Simone standing alone. Not deliberately, not cruelly, but repeatedly. And repetition matters. As days passed, the weight of that realization pressed down, not only on Simone, but on the marriage itself. Discussions about the future grew strained. Financial conversations became emotional traps. Retirement, once a distant milestone, now felt unreachable under the current reality. How do you plan tomorrow when you're still financing everyone else's today? That question followed her. She had spent years being strong for everyone. Strong enough to provide. Strong enough to forgive. Strong enough to absorb disappointment without cracking the image of family unity. But strength, when expected, eventually mutates into resentment. And resentment, left untouched, permanently reshapes relationships. Outside the home, the narrative took on a life of its own. Clips circulated online, stripped of nuance, but heavy with implication. Comment sections fractured instantly. Some applauded Dr. Simone for finally enforcing limits. Others criticized her as cold, disconnected, or out of touch. And then came the comparisons. Affluent families. Privileged children. Parents who bankroll adulthood indefinitely. The same argument echoed everywhere. If you can afford it, why not give it? But that question ignored something essential. Giving without boundaries isn't generosity. It's erasure. Erasure of the giver's needs. Erasure of long-term security. Erasure of personal limits. And erasure never lasts forever. As public opinion churned, Dr. Simone turned inward. Not out of embarrassment, but clarity. For the first time, she allowed herself to ask the question she had avoided for years. What if nothing changes? The answer was brutally clear. She would keep working far longer than planned. She would keep funding lifestyles without accountability. She would keep trading peace for the illusion of harmony. And worst of all, she would be teaching her children that love has no limit, even when it costs someone everything. That realization didn't come with tears. It came with resolve. The decision to file for divorce wasn't sudden. It wasn't retaliation. And it wasn't punishment. It was about control, not over others, but over her own life. Because marriage, like parenting, requires partnership. And partnership cannot survive when one person carries the emotional, financial, and psychological weight alone. Filing wasn't an admission of defeat. It was an acceptance of truth. For Cecil, the filing landed quietly but heavily. Not because he was unaware of the strain, but because he never believed it would go this far. He assumed time would soften the edges. That patience would eventually fix the imbalance. But patience without action doesn't correct dysfunction. It preserves it. And now, the cost of preservation had arrived. The family dynamic shifted almost overnight. What once felt permanent became conditional. Conversations turned formal. Distance became both emotional and physical. The structure holding everything together cracked, and denial was no longer an option. Michael, facing consequences for the first time, didn't respond with instant reflection. Entitlement rarely dissolves quietly. Instead came deflection, frustration, disbelief that limits were suddenly real. But consequences don't need agreement to exist. And for the first time, the safety net was no longer guaranteed. Public reaction intensified once the divorce became known. Headlines framed it as a breaking point. Commentators dissected every moment. Some blamed parenting. Others blamed marriage. Many blamed wealth itself. But those closest to the situation understood something deeper. This was never about excess. It was about exhaustion. The exhaustion of giving without reciprocity. Of being needed but never considered. Of realizing your worth has been measured by what you provide, not who you are. As the dust settled, one question lingered, louder than any argument. Was this the wake-up call the family needed, or the moment everything finally collapsed? Because sometimes, boundaries repair relationships. And sometimes, they reveal that what held things together was never balance, only endurance. For Dr. Simone, endurance was no longer an option. She had given enough. She had carried enough. And now, she was choosing something unfamiliar. Herself. And whether the family would rebuild from that choice, or fracture beneath it, was no longer hers to decide. Because when silence becomes a verdict, and love becomes obligation, the only question left is this. Is letting go the first step toward healing, or the end of everything they once believed they were? Time didn't dull the damage. It refined it. In the weeks after the divorce papers were filed, something subtle but undeniable began to happen. Not loudly, not publicly, but unmistakably. The family structure started to recalibrate. Without Dr. Simone quietly absorbing every fallout, the system that once survived on her endurance began to malfunction. Bills no longer vanished through autopay. Requests no longer received instant approval. Silence, once protective, now pressed in like weight. For the first time, accountability stopped being an idea. It became operational. Michael noticed the shift almost immediately. The safety net wasn't ripped away, it was reshaped. Conversations that once ended in yes now ended in pause. Permissions were replaced by explanations. And expectations that once felt endless were suddenly measured. That change was destabilizing. Entitlement doesn't disappear quietly. It pushes back. It reframes. It searches for another place to unload responsibility. But without Dr. Simone stepping in to rebalance every disruption, reality became harder to ignore. Independence sounds admirable until it's unavoidable. What followed wasn't growth at first. It was irritation, a muted resentment that consequences had arrived without negotiation, a belief that boundaries were unfair, that limits were punishment rather than protection. But boundaries don't exist to punish. They exist to define what's real. And reality asserts itself the moment illusion collapses. Cecil, meanwhile, found himself standing on unfamiliar ground. No longer hovering between peacekeeping and avoidance, he was forced to confront the cost of neutrality. The quiet he once believed maintained harmony hadn't prevented conflict, it had delayed it. Now, with the marriage officially fractured, silence no longer worked as a strategy. It functioned as absence. And absence invites reckoning. In private moments, Cecil replayed the years that led here. The times he chose not to step in. The conflicts he hoped would dissolve on their own. The limits he assumed adulthood would magically impose. They never did. Because boundaries don't appear naturally. They're taught, reinforced, repeated. When they aren't, entitlement fills the vacuum. From the outside, public reaction evolved too. Initial outrage softened into scrutiny. Blame gave way to pattern recognition. The conversation shifted from who failed to how a family with every advantage still reached collapse. The answer kept resurfacing, uncomfortably simple. Provision without accountability breeds dependence. Dependence without limits breeds resentment. And resentment eventually demands release. For Dr. Simone, the weeks after filing were quieter, but heavier. Choosing herself didn't erase the emotional cost. It clarified it. She had spent decades defining her value by what she gave. Now she was learning to define it by what she protected: her time, her future, her peace. Retirement discussions returned, this time anchored in realism rather than sacrifice. Financial planning shifted from reaction to intention. And for the first time in years, her life was no longer dictated entirely by crisis response. But clarity didn't equal comfort. There were moments of doubt. Moments when guilt crept back in. Moments when she wondered whether enforcing boundaries too late had already caused permanent damage. Each time, the answer was the same. Doing nothing would have cost more. Family gatherings that followed felt different. Civil, guarded, controlled. The warmth that once masked imbalance was replaced with caution. Conversations skirted old pressure points. Everyone moved carefully, as if testing a structure that might buckle under too much weight. And inside that caution, something else emerged. Awareness. Michael began to feel the difference between expectation and effort. Between want and means. The lesson didn't arrive dramatically, it arrived through inconvenience. Through waiting. Through the absence of instant solutions. Growth rarely announces itself. Sometimes it begins as discomfort. For Cecil, accountability took another shape. Supporting Dr. Simone now meant more than emotional presence. It meant recognizing where silence had functioned as approval, where avoidance had allowed imbalance to solidify. That recognition didn't undo the past, but it redirected what came next. The question hovering over everything wasn't whether the family could return to what it was. It was whether it should. Because what it once was relied on one person carrying everyone else. And that structure collapsed for a reason. If reconciliation came, it would have to look different. Boundaries where there were none. Accountability where expectation ruled. Partnership instead of dependence. That level of change is rare. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires humility. As months passed, public attention drifted elsewhere, as it always does. New scandals replaced old ones. New narratives took center stage. But inside this family, the reckoning continued quietly. No cameras. No commentary. No easy conclusions. Dr. Simone's choice accomplished what arguments never could. It disrupted the system enough to force evolution. Whether that evolution would lead to healing or permanent distance remained unknown. But one truth stood unshaken. When a woman who is given everything finally stops, the world doesn't collapse. It recalibrates. And sometimes, in that recalibration, people are finally forced to grow. This was never a story about money. It was about limits. About silence. About the cost of carrying everyone else for too long. And about the moment a mother refuses to disappear inside obligation and instead claims ownership of her life. Whether the family would rise to meet that change or fracture beneath it was no longer hers to decide. Because for the first time, she had already done the hardest thing. She let go. This was never meant to feel easy. This story was never designed for comfort. It was never really about a credit card, a luxury vehicle, or even a divorce on paper. It was about what happens when boundaries are postponed for too long and the cost finally demands payment. Dr. Simone didn't wake up one morning looking for confrontation. She arrived at a place where moving forward meant losing herself entirely. And in families like this, that moment doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly after years of carrying everyone else's weight. What unfolded wasn't just entitlement being exposed. It was burnout brought into the open. A mother realizing that love without limits can become a cage. A husband learning that silence, even when well-meaning, still produces consequences. And a son facing, perhaps for the first time, a world that doesn't bend itself around his expectations. There are no villains here, only choices. And choices, when ignored long enough, eventually make themselves. Some will argue Dr. Simone waited too long. Others will say she should have kept giving because that's what parents are supposed to do. And many will believe this family will eventually heal because blood is said to outlast conflict. But there's an uncomfortable question that refuses to disappear. If nothing had changed, how much more was she expected to give? Because accountability isn't cruelty. Limits aren't punishment. And choosing yourself isn't abandonment. It's survival. Now the question isn't whether this family can recover. It's whether recovery means rebuilding or walking away. And that's where this story leaves us. Not with closure, but with consequences. Tell us what you think. Was this the wake-up call that had to happen, or the moment everything went too far? The conversation doesn't stop here.